Well, welcome everyone from the CFCI to the second of our Cambridge Climate Emergency talks of this month. I'm going to hand over the chairing today to Anne Miller from Carbon Neutral Cambridge. And Anne is the chair of Carbon Neutral Cambridge, which is a volunteer organisation facilitating public discussion around the zero carbon message. Symptomatic, I think, of the widespread public engagement on this issue. So over to Anne, who's going to introduce today and our speakers.
Thanks very much, Meredith. So I'm sure everybody, so this is the second session, as Meredith said, and what we're looking at today is what are the barriers to zero carbon, particularly the practical application, the effectiveness of legislation, the cost and the technical issues. And most importantly, I'm very interested to get people's views on what can we do to overcome those barriers. So as I'm sure everybody who's attending this webinar recognises the urgency of getting to zero carbon. And just this morning, the Committee on Climate Change published the 6th carbon budget. This makes it very clear that it's entirely reasonable and credible to get to zero carbon by 2050, but we need to act now. And we need to get back on track, because currently we're not on track, so that by 2035, UK carbon emissions are 78% lower than they were in 2019. So the committee recommends 4 key steps: the take-up of low carbon solutions, the expansion of low carbon energy sources, reducing demand for carbon intensive activities, and land and greenhouse gas removals. And I think it's a 1,000-page report, so there's obviously lots of detail, which I haven't yet read. In the built environment, their key measures are that by the early 2030s, all boiler replacements in homes and other buildings should be low carbon, which will be largely electric, and that buildings lose much less energy through a national programme to improve insulation across the UK. So as Joel Gustafsson said last week, buildings are the low-hanging fruit. We absolutely have to deliver. So the measures they propose are no-brainers, but as always, as with any change, there are barriers to overcome. So I'm very pleased that in today's session, we're joined by 3 experienced practitioners: Andrew Turnbull of Norwich City Council, Annabel Clark, Associate Director of Faithful+Gould, and Emma Davis, Sustainability Manager at Greater Cambridge Partnership, Cambridge Partnership, and they'll help us explore these barriers. And most importantly, as I say, how to overcome them. So before I introduce our first speaker, I would just point out that if you have any questions or comments to make, please put them in the chat in the system, and Meredith will be keeping an eye on the chat, and then at the appropriate time we'll be taking the questions that are in the chat. So thank you very much. So to introduce Andrew. Andrew is the Interim Housing Development Manager at Norwich City Council. He's worked at Norwich City Council for the last 12 years and was the client project lead for the Sterling Prize winning Goldsmith development. This has been described as, quotes, the future of sustainable, affordable housing. And Andrew saw the project through from inception to completion. So I look forward to hearing from Andrew about his thoughts about about the barriers to overcome and how you do it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just going to share my screen. So what are the barriers to zero carbon? I've taken this very much from our perspective at Norwich City Council. And so there's a number of barriers that we were faced with when we were looking at our development programme. So we had national government policy at the time, which was driving to zero carbon by 2016. And that was obviously subsequently scrapped, and we're now looking at 2050. We had a number of sort of planning policies in place that when we were looking at what we wanted to actually achieve, it didn't quite fit what we wanted to do. So for example, in Norwich, we have a requirement for 10% renewable energy. What we managed to do is speak to our planning policy colleagues and say, we'd like to go down the route of a fabric first approach rather than renewables. And so we went for a passive house solution, and planning policy was subsequently changed to help us to achieve that in Norwich. local authorities have been under attack in terms of finance for some time now. And every time we think that we've got a business plan that's sorted that will help us to deliver going forward, the rules just seem to change a little bit, not least around right to buy. So in 2012, we signed an agreement to take on part of the National Housing Revenue Account debt in order to be able to have freedom to keep all of our rents. Shortly after that, government reinvigorated right to buy to push it from, I think, £34,000 discount up to a £75,000 discount, which means that we're now selling 100 a year more than we expected to. We've had a rent cut of 1%, which took 25 million, I think, out of our 4-year business plan, and about 250 million over our 30-year business plan. We can build an awful lot of homes for that amount of money. And we've also got other kind of issues politically around fuel poverty that we're trying to address. But for local authorities, new build housing was not something that we'd done for some time. So there are big reputational risks for us to step into that market and think about doing it again when there are already established players through registered providers and developers who are doing that. So we kind of started off slowly by working alongside a registered provider partner, building our knowledge, building our capacity, and then we were able to take things forward ourselves. When it came to looking at Passive House, the barriers there were primarily around costs. And I would point you towards the Passive House construction costs report that's shown on the screen there from October 2019. We fed into that report. And I think it does kind of demystify some of the increased costs for Passive House. And certainly on Goldsmith Street, we've learned lessons that would help us to be able to deliver cheaper in the future. A lot of cost is associated with contractors pricing in risk because they haven't done Passive House before. We were lucky in Norwich that R.G. Carter, who built Goldsmith Street, and others who we had on a framework of contractors had all delivered Passive House, albeit on a smaller scale, with Hastow Housing Association and Broadland Housing Association in particular, having delivered a number of units. We've started to look at not just the capital cost of the development, though. We've started to look at the whole life costing. And I think this is important because local authorities and registered providers have a long-term stewardship of these properties. Ideally, we'll own them for 50, 60, 70 years. That allows us to think about a longer term business plan. And on Goldsmith Street, we looked at the cost of the materials and realised that we were using much more robust materials that wouldn't need replacing quite so often. And the example that our maintenance team use quite a lot with me is UPVC double glazed windows. They'll replace every 25 years. Triple glazed aluminium windows, they'll look at replacing every 40 years. So if you look at a 40 or 50 year business plan, that initial capital cost is spread out over the life of that project. Some of the other kind of costs are associated with new technologies like MVHR units that we haven't put into properties before. And I think there it's about, in the UK, we're not quite ready to give up our radiators as well as having MVHR units. And so there perhaps is some duplication of costs there. And I think going forward with decarbonisation of the grid, we'll certainly not be using gas and full wet systems going forward. We'll probably have electric boilers and electric heaters and things like that, which again, we only need 1 or 2 heaters within the building. That'll help us to reduce our costs and our maintenance bills. And so finally, it's about building typologies. So it's about having typologies that you can repeat. And so therefore you get economies of scale from. And I think, again, that helps that financial kind of appraisal. And terraced houses, as we used on Goldsmith Street, they're a very efficient form of building, which means that we were able to kind of get some efficiencies through that. Finally, I'll kind of move on to the lessons from Goldsmith Street. And I think for us, it was really important that we had advocates. So that was our local registered provider partners, their tenants. They were happy to share their experience and their knowledge with us, the lessons that they'd learned, the mistakes that they'd made. And I think sharing knowledge is a key thing around delivering zero carbon. It's about learning from others' mistakes. what I've found is it's a really helpful industry. So people who have delivered this type of housing, they're more than happy to share with you. Talked about building form and orientation. It won't suit every site to do passive house, and so orientation will help you reduce costs, and certainly the building forms. I think importantly for me, we had a JCT standard contract rather than a design and build. And that meant that we were able to ensure that quality on site, with architects overseeing the delivery, clerk of works, materials being run past not just the architects, but also our passive house consultants, to make sure that it was still delivering what we'd set out to deliver. Touched on contractor experience, and yeah, it was key for us that RG Carter had already done a passive house scheme, so they understood the sequencing that was required for passive house. And then finally, the lessons that we've kind of picked up that we need to do a bit more on is about education for our tenants and explaining a little bit more upfront to them about what living in a passive house means, how to run them MVHR unit to its most efficient, that no matter how many times you tell them that they can open their windows when it's too hot, they still read the myths that you can't do that. So you can't tell them enough that they can ventilate naturally when it's too hot in the summer. But I think all of those lessons come together and give us the comments that we've received from some of our tenants. And I think the top one there is probably the most important one that I've had anecdotally from one of our tenants. Was they'd lived there for 5 months throughout the dead of winter, and they hadn't had their heating on once. That tells me that we've got the build right. It tells me that we're doing the right things, and it's about reducing fuel poverty for our tenants. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That is really, really fascinating. And so we'll take the questions at the end. So if you have questions for Andrew, do put them in the chat. But say the questions at the end. So we'll now move on to hear from Annabel Clark, who is an Associate Director in the Strategic Asset Management team of the project and management consultancy Faithful+Gould. Annabel works to influence the sustainability measures to improve the environmental, social and economic value of projects. Her role involves providing design advice, practical application of sustainable building solutions. And a key focus of her work is energy efficiency and reducing carbon emissions. So I'll be very interested to hear what Annabel has to tell us. Over to you, Annabel.
Thanks, Anne. If I just share my screen. So yeah, thank you very much. Obviously the focus today is barriers to net zero carbon, and I've been asked to talk today looking at this from the aspect of speaking for a client and how the barriers to net zero carbon are stopping us from what everyone wants to do. You know, we see net zero carbon in all the headlines. I think, you know, the majority of people want to do the right thing. We want to achieve net zero carbon, and we want to achieve it as quickly as possible. But we're stuck within certain barriers. So what is it that stops everyone from acting as quickly as they possibly can? So I've pulled out 5 key points that I believe is why these barriers come to fruition. These are cost, risk, innovation and availability, stakeholder engagement, and then data, design and understanding. Now I'm sure, you know, as we go through the Q&A, there'll be plenty more that come up, but I think that these are kind of some buckets of barriers that we come across on a regular basis. So in the work that I look at, we're often focusing, or we are focusing, on the built environment and working with clients to, in the first place, look at their net zero carbon roadmap after they've made those firm commitments, and then looking at the implementation of that into the buildings, and then once those interventions are undertaken, how we can actually keep operating a net zero carbon building. So if we go first to cost, what is the cost uplift? I think this is the question I probably get asked the most on a day-to-day basis. You know, we've got to the point that we want to deliver a net zero carbon building or a net zero carbon solution, or even a city. What is the cost uplift of that? And the answer really is that we don't fully know. There have been studies that have come out, as Andrew mentioned there's the brilliant Passive House Construction Cost Report that's just come out. The UK Green Building Council have also just released their Building the Case for Net Zero Carbon. And this showed that in an office block, you're looking at an 8 to 17% cost uplift, while in an apartment block, you might be looking at more like a 5% uplift. So there's lots of different information out there, but as this market is maturing, we'll get a much better idea of what that cost uplift is, and what's already being done on a project. So what is purely a cost uplift for net zero carbon? We need to look at whole life value. I mean, that's absolutely key. A capital cost is only one part of that project, and we need to make sure that when we're building projects, the capital cost team and the operational costs are being looked at as a collective. So a project isn't being scrapped from the outset just based on that capital cost. So as Andrew mentioned again, whole life value, we're looking at the maintenance, replacements, and the overall value that these items can bring. And sustainability and carbon has to become a key part of that metric. In terms of risk, there's quite a lot of risk involved in net zero carbon. You know, there's currently no complete set pathway to this. There's been lots and lots of brilliant reports come out, and a huge momentum of those over the last year. But as a sector, we need to embrace the uncertainty in net zero carbon and make sure that we are driving towards innovation and availability of all these technologies. Is there additional risk involved in a net zero carbon building? Again, you know, we might be looking at timber frames, and there is the possibility there of additional insurance costs on those from a fire risk. Now, there are certain things that we can do there to make sure that, you know, the right accreditation is in place so that that risk is being limited as far as possible. There's some risk in innovative technology. You know, I think as clients, we want to make sure that our facilities management teams can properly operate all the technology that we put in, that the occupants are on board as far as behaviour is concerned, so the openable windows, the controls. And is it a good investment? Is it a risk in terms of the finance on the project? And that's where we really need to bring that back to the cost and the whole life value. Stakeholder engagement is quite a big barrier. I think as we started with, people are really keen to do the right thing, look at sustainability, and I've popped the Sustainable Development Goals up in the top right-hand corner of this presentation, because while we're focusing on net zero carbon here, we need to look at this holistically. You know, a lot of those UN Sustainable Development Goals, so you're looking at climate action and clean energy, they can't be looked at in isolation. We need to bring everyone along on that journey and make sure that we are making, you know, your building, the city, your country, the world, a more prosperous place for all and not leaving anyone behind. So what we found here is that actually quite often the barrier is that you might be talking to one particular person on net zero carbon, and we need to be making sure we're tailoring that message to specific stakeholders. So if you're talking to your CEO, your CFO, your facilities management officer, or an occupant of that building, or a road user, you need to tailor that message quite differently to talk about the pain points and how you overcome those together, but also focusing on the gain from supporting that transition to net zero carbon. Data is a huge one. Lack of data, particularly in the built environment. So to be able to implement an effective net zero carbon strategy, particularly for your existing estate, because remember, the most sustainable buildings that we have are ones that are already built. We need to retrofit those. Is lack of data. So we need to make sure we have measurable processes in place so that we can look at where those buildings are performing and where they're not performing, and where the biggest difference we can have is. Early engagement, so making sure that we integrate net zero carbon from the start. As a whole, we all like solutions that we know, we don't like change, so making sure that we upskill people on what net zero carbon solutions are. And that can require some radical change, and there are also some much more minor change things that we can look at. We need to focus on outcome-based solutions, so not just being pushed into some of these interventions just based on a certification. We want that outcome. So it's efficient asset management. And then finally, innovation and availability. So as I said, there is no set pathway to net zero carbon, particularly in existing, you know, where we already have an existing estate. There's much better processes in place for new builds. But businesses need to become comfortable with not having all the answers. We're looking at 2050, that's a long way off. There'll be a lot of technical solutions that come in between now and then, some that we know of, like hydrogen, which hopefully will come and answer a lot of those solutions. But the uncertainty and challenges should be seen as opportunities for innovation and transformation. So we need to start small and build from there, knowing that not all the solutions are fully available, but we're allowing them to be flexible and adaptable so that we don't cause ourselves more barriers and more problems for the future. So how do we unlock that? I mean, we need to overcome all those barriers. So let's identify experienced delivery partners, upskill everyone, and that includes your design teams, your contractors, your facilities managers, and everyone, the general public, your road users, your occupants of your buildings. You verify the net zero outcomes. You allow time and start early on every single project that we look at. We focus on whole life value, and we prioritize the environment in everything that we do, so it becomes a key metric. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabel. Really, really interesting set of guidelines and principles there. And so, again, I say, if you have any questions that you want to put to Annabel or to Andrew, do put them into the chat. And we'll now hear from Emma Davis, who works for the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service as a Principal Sustainability Officer. Her role includes developing planning policy related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and she's currently working with both bioregional and Etude on the evidence base for the development of the net zero carbon policies for the Greater Cambridge local plan. In addition to that, she also provides technical advice on planning applications and wider corporate projects related to sustainable design and construction. And outside of the planning service, Emma is a member of the local adaptation advisory panel steering group, which provides advice to government on the role of local authorities in delivering climate change adaptation. And she's also a member of the Good Homes Alliance. So I'm really pleased that she's found the time to come and share her thoughts with us. So over to you, Emma.
Lovely, thanks, Anne. So yeah, I'm going to take you through, I've limited myself to 3 slides and 3 challenges because I could go on about this for quite a long time. So I've limited myself to 3 challenges, focusing in really on some of the stuff that I see in my day-to-day work, focusing in on kind of new built environment and planning applications. So I think the first challenge that we face from a planning perspective is actually how long it takes for us to develop new planning policies. I am very clear that planning has got a very significant role to play in responding to net zero carbon, because it's all about placemaking and designing places that facilitate kind of societal choices and behaviours that we all need to adopt in order to transition to net zero carbon. There's a significant role for the design of new buildings in reducing energy demand and facilitating the optimal use of renewable energy. A challenge I often hear is, well, a lot of this is for building regulations. But my view is that actually we need to be working together with colleagues in building regulations, or rather building control, to facilitate kind of zero carbon operational emissions, as well as considering the wider role of planning in facilitating that shift to net zero. But here's the big but, and here's the big challenge, and that's that it does take quite a long time to develop new planning policies. It's not a quick process, and there is a risk that, you know, you develop planning policy at a certain date, but it could be out of date by the time that you've adopted your planning document. I'm sure that many on the call today will remember how long it took us to get our current local plans through examination. I actually drafted for the Cambridge plan the climate change policies back in late 2012. We submitted our plan for examination in 2013, and then we didn't adopt until October 2018. So it was quite a long process. And this slide here actually illustrates the process that we are now going through to prepare our new local plan, which is covering Greater Cambridge as a whole, so Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire. So there is a danger that between now and when we come to adopt our plan, that we won't have those policies in place to respond to net zero carbon with the sense of urgency that is required. My view is that we need to start building towards net zero carbon now, otherwise we will just be adding to the somewhat, I think it's around 28 million homes in the UK that we will already need to be retrofitting. And planned changes to building regulations will take us some of the way there, but only in relation to energy use in buildings. And net zero carbon is so much bigger than just thinking about energy use in buildings. And that takes me to my next challenge. And that's this idea that we actually need to get away from thinking in silos and just ensuring that responding to net zero carbon isn't just for one person to deal with. The most successful schemes that I've been involved with to date are those where during the sustainability discussions of pre-application meetings, it's not just me talking building physics, which really is not my strong point, and renewable energy with the M&E consultants in the room. And I'm not dissing M&E consultants, they have a really important job. But actually the most successful schemes are where every single discipline on this slide has had an input into the sustainability strategy. It starts with the client being very clear at the strategic definition stage what their sustainability aspirations are, and the need for responding to the climate emergency to be at the very heart of the design of every single element of the schemes. I really do strongly feel that we could be making significant strides now if we start working collaboratively, and dare I say it, if we start to take some really brave decisions ahead of changes to building regulations. There are a lot of uncertainties, but we also know some of the basics of what we need to be doing. So why wait till regulation changes? I think one of the ways around some of these challenges is to actually start working collaboratively now and thinking really early on in the design process. And my final challenge, and this is quite a significant one for me, is that we actually do have a lack of clarity at the national level. So we've got the 6th climate budget released today. I've not had a chance to look at that yet, but we also had the announcement earlier on in the week that the Prime Minister has announced a target of a 68% cut in emissions by 2030. On the face of it, that's a good step forward. I think there is potentially room to do a little bit more than that, but we still don't have a clear set of policies and actions at a national level to deliver this. And added to that is a complete lack of joined up thinking on climate change across departments. And these are just a couple of headlines that I've picked up on from the last few weeks. The first was the announcement in the 10-point plan that the ban on gas boilers in new homes would be brought forward to 2023. And then that magically disappeared from the 10-point plan the day after. The second is an analysis of the spending review, which has just announced £127 billion for spending on HS2 and new roads, which will both increase emissions, and then just £1 billion for home insulation, which would not only reduce emissions, but it would create 4 times as many jobs than road building. And for me, this kind of lack of clarity and this lack of a joined up approach is a significant challenge, and it does very little to instill confidence that we can actually all move forwards on this journey to net zero carbon. I'm going to leave it there because I think we'd all like probably more time for Q&A. So that's it for me, but I could probably go on about some of this for quite a long time. So I shall shut up now.
So thank you very much, Emma. Absolutely. Absolutely correct set of three real challenges there facing us. So Meredith has been keeping an eye on the chat, and so Meredith, what question would you suggest we start with?
Well, there's a few specific ones that have come in, but actually I'd like to go back and just think more broadly about some of the things that have come up. And one thing that's seems to be consistent in quite a lot of presentations I've heard around this subject, and both Andrew and Annabel talked about it, is risk and the pricing of risk. So what is, you know, for those of us that have been working in this field for many years, it seems like it should not be there. There's lots of things that are very well understood and even codified, and yet the idea that this is a risky operation that needs to be costed in often in inflated ways, seems to be one of the clear barriers. So I wonder, Annabel, perhaps you could start by talking a bit more about what you suggested that needs to be done in order to change the culture where the risk of something which is going to be, in all likelihood, a legislative obligation for us, can, in the near future, we can make changes to the perception of what how that risk should be costed.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's the perception, isn't it? And it's the perception of that risk. And I think in a lot of cases, it's is that we don't necessarily have that data. And so you might see on a design cost plan that, you know, it is a single line figure for a net zero carbon uplift. Now, what we want to try and get to the point of is that we can look at actually what those individual elements are, and not seeing it as an overall risk to the project. We begin to understand it a lot more, and particularly in buildings, as a lot more are built, we'll get that real data, and we'll have cost plans that have gone all the way through to completion. In terms of quite specific risks, I guess, you know, I mentioned the risk of things such as timber frame, where the industry is still perceiving that as a risk, and very much based, or a lot of that is based on the risk of ignition from fire. And I think that is something that probably, as you say, you know, as legislation comes in and it becomes something that we look at much more from an embodied carbon point of view, we need to work with those bodies to make sure that that cost isn't being inflated above where it should be, and actually just make sure that design teams and contractors and then building operators have put in place the right measures to make sure that that risk is reduced and mitigated, so that that insurance premium doesn't have to increase. And I think that's really where we just need to get to, is looking at them as tried and tested solutions, so we reduce that risk and the perceived risk, and talk more about that.
I mean, certainly it's going to change over time. You know, when the zero carbon homes by 2016 was scrapped, we were all tearing our hair out because, you know, by that time many contractors had begun to understand what was required, and then suddenly that skill and impetus was lost. Andrew, picking up further on the idea of risk, really interesting to know that Goldsmith Street was procured via a traditional JCB contract. We've had a mention in the chat from a contractor who wondered where they fit into the equation here. And, you know, was it about the understanding that you wanted to be in greater control that led to the traditional contract? And could there be a future where the de facto position, which is a design and build that nearly everyone, especially corporate clients, use, would be suitable to employ?
Yeah, I think when you look at the cost quality time triangle, for us, quality was the number one when we were looking at Goldsmith Street. And I think that kind of naturally led us to look at a more controlled contract. Our members in particular wanted to make sure that, as this was likely to be the biggest passive house scheme in the UK at the time, that we didn't fall foul of it kind of having issues. And so maintaining that control and that quality on site was really important for us. We did also feel that it helped us to manage the price risk a little bit, because, you know, the risk is more on our side as the client with that, rather than it just being buried in prelims and what have you from a contractor. But the contractor is absolutely key to managing that risk of delivering passive house or other zero carbon schemes, because you need to have people who have got the experience of doing it so that they can understand the different ways of working, and so therefore understand that the risk isn't there. And I think, you know, by driving it through legislation, hopefully more and more people will have the experience of delivering zero carbon and passive house. It becomes more the norm, so therefore that price gets driven down through economies of scale and all of those other things. But yeah, I would be an advocate for using traditional contracts for schemes that aren't just the norm until they become the norm.
Thank you very much, Andrew. A question on legislation, Emma. It's on the one hand, there's your depressing reminder of how long it took for your work to come into force, and on the other hand, an entreaty for everyone to work together to a common aim. What is it the case, which I'm beginning to fear that it is it the case that local authorities who almost, and there's so many local authorities whose ambitions are greater or higher than central governments, are literally prevented from making changes themselves that are not supported by central government legislation? Is it the case that you have to simply wait until national policy comes in place, or are there levers that the local authority can put in place that will improve our path to zero carbon?
So I think that's a challenge that we're all facing at the moment. So we have got kind of legislative levers at the moment that do continue to allow us to go beyond building regulations through our planning policy development. So we still have relevant clauses in the Planning and Energy Act, for example, that enable us to set higher levels of carbon reduction from new development. Now, that is something that governments have been thinking removing for quite a long time. They have yet to enact that removal of that clause of the Act, but it is there. And we've had a number of local planning authorities recently who have been successful in going for London plan style policies related to carbon reduction. I think Reading were the most recent local planning authority who adopted a policy. We are looking at that now as part of the work that Anne referenced that we're doing with Bioregional and Etude. So there are ways around it, and to some extent there is a kind of test between legislative requirements through the Climate Change Act, through the Planning Act and the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act versus what's in the NPPF, and I'm sure there'll be lots more of those discussions at examinations in the future. But there are things we can do, and I think we need to be clear as well that, you know, net zero carbon's a lot more than just energy use in buildings. There's the whole transport side as well that we need to be addressing, clear role for planning in that. So I'm sure, you know, there are going to be more discussions along those lines in future local plan examinations, but, you know, my view is we've got such a strong role to play that we have to push those policies forward as much as we can. And I think as well we need to think about other ways in the medium term to secure more ambitious commitments from development. So, you know, we're looking at what's the role of planning conditions for really big sites, so that sustainability strategies are reviewed every few years just so that they can try and keep up with changes in policy nationally. But yeah, it is challenging.
I think the Future Home Standard is kind of trying to water down that even more, isn't it, by saying you shouldn't have local policy.
Yeah, it is indeed.
Yes, that's a fear. So it hasn't yet come out, but that's what they were flagging, that it was going to say, that by imposing a national Future Home Standard, it would then preclude local authorities from making their own decisions, which would be great if the Future Home Standard was really, really robust and very strong, and not so great if it was a watered down version that we could have done 10 years ago. A little bit more on planning, if we may. There's been a few questions about specific questions about planning. One of them, it's quite a big one actually, is gas boilers are going to evidently be no longer legal to install. How are the planners able to deal with the fact that everyone's going to have an air source heat pump? Where they're going to go, what provision is made? Is that a specific planning, even supplementary planning guidance that needs to come in? And secondly, for Andrew, were there any exceptions or changes that were needed to be made to your own planning policies in order to build Goldsmith Street? And did you have to persuade a lot of people to make those changes or to adopt the standard that you did? So that's sort of one for Emma and Andrew between you.
Do you want to go first, Emma?
If I pick up on the point on air source heat pumps, so there are obviously some planning considerations in that. So we're already, you know, encouraging developers in pre-app discussions that we're having now to think about alternatives to gas. Seeing a lot of commercial development already switching from gas to an all-electric approach. Obviously, with things like air source heat pumps, it does require some quite careful consideration as to where they're going to be located, because they're not the prettiest of things to look at. So maybe thinking about communal air source heat pumps rather than each flat having its own individual heat pump. Could those be integrated into roof design, for example, or is there somewhere on the site you could tuck them away? Thinking as well about acoustic impacts as well. Obviously not ruling out other forms of heating, so ground source heat pumps where that is possible. I know that there are space constraints with that. We're having a bit of a debate at the moment of what would we rather see. Would we rather see air source heat pumps or direct electric? And I think for me, direct electric needs to be accompanied by passive house levels of performance and fabric performance because of the costs of direct electric. But yeah, I think it's certainly somewhere where we probably need to start thinking quite soon, you know, what are the impacts of seeing a lot more air source heat pumps? I've been assured by consultants that we won't end up with blocks of flats that look like they're from Singapore with every single unit having, you know, an air source heat pump on its balcony. So I think we need to look at, for me, before we think about the heating technology, drive down that energy demand, drive down the heating demand, then think about, you know, what's the best heating approach, and think about where you put it quite carefully to limit design impacts.
Yeah, I would wholly agree with that. I think it's interesting because obviously from a social housing perspective, electricity is more expensive than gas. And if we're trying to address fuel poverty, it's got to go hand in hand with a fabric first approach so that you reduce the demand in the first place. In terms of Goldsmith Street and planning policy, yeah, so we did persuade our planning policy colleagues to go for passive house instead of 10% renewables. Obviously, if we're going down to net zero carbon, confession here, Goldsmith Street is not net zero carbon. If we want to get down to those sort of levels, then we need to look at renewables plus passive house. And certainly, Mikhail Richards are now doing work with York around that and about being zero carbon in use by the use of PVs, air source heat pumps, and other things. The concern I have slightly about air source and ground source heat pumps is whether they actually deliver as well as they say they do. I've worked on a scheme 10 years ago in Norwich with ground source heat pumps, and they're now talking about replacing it because it's not working as efficiently as it should have done. That's a worry that if we kind of think about these new technologies, I know they've been around a while, but are they actually performing as well as they should? Other planning policies that we did kind of change for Goldsmith Street was around the overlooking distances to get the densities up. So we went from 18 to 20 metres to a 14 metre difference. That allowed us to get about 20 extra units on the site. We had some conditions around putting shutters in for privacy and things like that. But I think all in all, it's about working alongside the planning team. They will understand that if you're delivering a scheme of quality, that they need to maybe be some compromises here or there. And I think that's where local policy can perhaps be a bit more flexible.
Great, that's fantastic responses to that. Annabel, there were a number of points in your collective presentations about sort of cost versus value, and the whole life cost and the whole life value, and the difficulty of squaring out the capital expenditure, running costs, and the normal commercial valuation. Is this something that, with your knowledge of a broad range of client bodies, something that is beginning to become a really significant change? Because we all know that unless the kind of long-term value can be captured somehow, I imagine for it to really work, it needs to be somehow passed on with the building. Is that something that is being, or you're experiencing with your clients?
Yeah, we definitely are. So I think it's something that's being asked for a lot more. We're seeing it either through clients wanting to understand that, maybe in upfront business cases and feasibility studies where they'll ask for a life cycle costing study to be done alongside, the QS's capital cost report. That's asked for in many BREEAM certifications, which is often how people are looking as kind of the governance structure of how to certify their building. So they're looking at it through life cycle costing. We've just seen the government construction playbook was released yesterday, and that goes into a lot of detail around whole life value, social value, and trying to look at things not just from a cost perspective, but looking at that value that it can add to the client and to the project.
Yes, I'm sure that is a conversation that many of us are having, and plenty of clients and client bodies are struggling with what the correct answer should be. And I'm sure that the people who are advocates are having to persuade other people within the organisation, not to say that we shouldn't push for it wherever we can. Some questions about skills, I suppose, education, skills. Another question related to it about the performance gap that we all know is well documented, about the difference between energy in use as opposed to energy calculated, which relates to the way things are built, which is deviates from the kind of calculated way that they might perform. I mean, Andrew, you talked about having, or part of your success being due to the fact you worked with a contractor, you had faith, knew what they were doing because they'd been there before. I wonder if anyone has had conversations with contractors about whether or not it's an issue for them about being able to build to the standards that are required, or in terms of the kind of perceived risk that Annabel talked about. Is that something in terms of availability of information and or technical ability to be able to build to required standards?
Yeah, I think it was an important point for us. We also, alongside kind of delivering a number of passive house schemes, we tried to work with Eastern College by setting up a passive house module for their construction courses. It didn't kind of seem to take off too well, and I think it only survived the year that we kind of helped fund it for, which is a real shame. But we had some of our suppliers who gave up stuff for free, gave up time for free. We had some training from our passive house clerk of works, and it was kind of like a really positive step. And I think the problem with being in Norwich is that some of the contractors felt, well, we already know it, we already do it, so they then didn't take up that training opportunity. But it is a key issue that needs to be got round. I think for me, until it's kind of in legislation that we need to drive towards these standards, then you won't get the major house builders putting their people through the training, and you need the kind of critical mass of the industry as a whole embracing this and training people with the right skills and the right understanding to be able to do it. So apprenticeships, there needs to be work with construction colleges about skilling up people for the future and recognizing that the future is coming and it might come quicker than we perhaps anticipate. So I think it's a key thing that government could help support through economic delivery.
I think that skills and training is an absolutely vital part. I think that has to be the focus. I think there's also quite a lot to be said in terms of, we're looking at it from the carbon and the sustainability point of view, but actually a better performing building is a better quality building. And I think that often when we're talking, about looking at different stakeholders and how we can sell it to them almost, and we're looking at energy efficiency, decarbonising heat, decarbonising power, and actually looking to reduce that demand. If you have a building that is airtight and you can prove that it has the certification, it's got those quality standards, you're going to have a better performing building and reduce that performance gap. And that has to start right from that design stage. So you need to also be modelling based on the actual use of the building. You need to involve facilities management and the occupants. And there are processes out there to do that. So, when you're looking at soft landings, or you're looking at specific modelling techniques, or looking at a post-occupancy evaluation, that's where the focus needs to be. And that has to be driven from the clients so that the design team and the contractor carry that out.
I was on a another conference earlier today with the Oxford Growth Board, and they had Professor Gupta speaking there about research that Oxford Brookes are doing around comparisons and state of the nation. And I think Emery also mentioned a Good Homes Alliance building standards comparison report. So I think there's some research coming out around performance gaps and showing that Passive House has much lower performance gaps than others.
Yeah, and we're also encouraging at the moment in pre-application discussions, we're encouraging people to move away from using SAP for doing their carbon calculations, because we all know it's not the most reliable of tools. So I think there is something around kind of the metrics that we're using and the tools that we're using, and looking at different ways to get a much more accurate reflection of performance.
Yeah, that is great. I think if there's one thing that will make a bigger difference, it's specifying airtightness, because in order for you to, it's measurable once the building is built, and you can only achieve it by looking at all of the things that you're building as you go along before it's all covered up. So if there was one bit of legislation I would propose, it would be applying an airtightness standard as a single bit of legislation over the top of everything else. I think it would solve an awful lot in one go.
And on Goldsmith Street, we link payment to achieving those 3 airtight tests on each property.
Yes, very sensible. Emma, there's a brilliant question that's come in, which is so abroad, but in some ways gets to the heart of everything. Is there an argument for greater weighting towards sustainability considerations in the development of future planning policies? This is a question from Mike Osborne. And this is what you've been doing for the last 10 years or more. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit, you mentioned about the performance of buildings being only one aspect of that, about both the breadth of the sustainable policies that you're looking at, and exactly how they're going to be embedded in the new local plan.
So I think we need to look quite carefully at how we integrate some of these elements into our design policies, and also things like we already have policies in the Cambridge Plan and the South Cambridgeshire Plan on kind of heritage assets and climate change, and that is obviously quite a sensitive issue. There's a kind of balance that needs to be taken when you look at heritage assets and thinking about, what's the significance of that asset. But I think as well as us looking at policies around kind of energy and energy intensity and renewables, we need to have those design policies that are thinking about, the importance of good design, the importance of kind of building typologies, orientating roofs for renewables. Even I had a query from one of our planning officers this morning about the issue of new developments overshadowing existing solar panels on roofs and those issues. So it's quite complex actually thinking about developing future planning policy for net zero carbon, because it is going to be so very different to our current, Merton rule policies or percentage carbon reduction policies. So I think, it's one of the things that bioregion are looking at for us, and I think we'll need to have discussions as we move forward on kind of writing up policies and drafting policies with colleagues in urban design, with colleagues in conservation, just to make sure that everybody's bought into this and we're doing what we can across all the different elements that planning looks at. So the new build, the retrofit, it's a very complex picture. We have been talking about whether we do some work looking at some standard building typologies across the area in terms of retrofit, and almost kind of come up with like a little toolkit of things that you could do to retrofit your building. So that's something that we're having internal discussions about at the moment, whether we kind of do a specific piece of work on that, and that could then look at, what's the most common typology in the area where we could make the most benefit from retrofitting, because I'm sure there'd be uproar if we all suggested kind of looking at King's College Chapel and doing some quite significant kind of retrofit measures there. But I think if we kind of take an approach where we're looking at where can we make the most bang for our buck where could we make the most improvement. I think that's quite an important area, but it's a huge challenge. I've started having those conversations with my colleagues in the part of the planning service that I sit in, and I think we will be having those conversations quite a lot now moving forwards about how this all gets integrated.
And could you give us an idea of timescales? We've called this the Cambridge Climate Emergency Month, and the groundswell of support for rapid and immediate change, I think, has been astonishing over the last 2 years. What sort of time period can we expect?
Well, I think there's already some work being procured in the next month or so, looking at retrofit opportunities in the council's own building stock. So that is being done as a kind of matter of urgency. I think we will be drafting local plan policies over the next year, so that's where some of that takes a little bit longer, but we can still be having those discussions, I suppose, as applications come forward as well, and kind of as part of pre-application discussions. The planning policy side of things, it does take a little bit longer.
We have understood that. We had Sam Hunt-Jones from Climate Earth on last week, who made it clear that it does have to go through the system. And if there was a guide that had some really, really straightforward and easily understood metrics, and that was brought in as a supplementary guide, to what extent can they be relied upon, or to what extent can the council enforce something that's in a supplementary guide?
It's a difficult one. They're more open to challenge because supplementary planning documents are only supposed to add detail to existing adopted policy. So what we've tried to do through our existing supplementary planning document is to encourage developers to think about how they can transition to net zero carbon and thinking about how they future-proof developments coming forward now. But I think if we tried to introduce an SPD that was in effect introducing new policy, we would possibly come up against more appeals. So that's the kind of the horrible balance that needs to be struck. But I think for me, if we can start having really early engagement at the pre-application stage, I think, as Andrew was saying, you know, they encouraged their planners to move away from adopted policy for their kind of passive house schemes. And I've done exactly the same thing in pre-app discussions in Cambridge. If it's considered early on enough, I am open to moving away from adopted policy and looking at new approaches that go way beyond our policy. So don't wait for kind of planning policy would be my key message. You know, bring stuff forward now. I'm not expecting full net zero carbon now, but make some kind of steps towards it, I think would be a great thing to see.
Thank you very much. There are a few other questions coming in, but a number of them are quite specific towards buildings. So we've run out of time today, but I would encourage people that have been asking questions that are building specific to come next week, where we'll be having individuals who are giving case studies, and I think we'll be able to get into much more detailed conversations about what you actually do in a one-off building situation. But probably we have to call it a day in terms of questions. So over to you, Anne, to wrap up today.
Well, I would just like to thank everybody, both our inspiring and knowledgeable panelists and everybody who's been participating on the chat with such interesting questions. I'm really sorry we haven't had time to answer all of them, but I would say that I think I'm correct to say, Meredith, the presentations are going to be on the CFCI website, and in due course there'll be a recording of this. Yeah, I think that's correct, isn't it, Meredith?
It won't be there quite yet, but it will be on in due course.
Yeah, so keep checking on the CFCI website, and you'll be able to get back, because I mean, I know that I've found such a wealth of information and ideas that it's actually quite a struggle to keep track of the flow. So key things that have emerged from this for me is firstly the importance of collaboration. It's an immensely exciting time of which some will perceive as risk and innovation, and some will find that exciting, and some will find that horrific. And it's meaning that new stakeholders, new partners need to get together. Together we can crack this. whether it's the ecologists, the clients, the M&E consultants, the architects. And then the second message, key message I pulled out of this is don't wait. We can see the direction of travel. It's absolutely clear. And even if the planning policy is going to take a few years to actually happen, get stuck in now, get ahead of the game. And finally, we are, as Emma points out, handicapped by complete confusion and lack of clarity from central government. But nevertheless, there's actually a real opportunity in the coming year. We have the COP21 in a year's time, just under a year's time, which gives a real opportunity to be pushing for clear and strong policies. And we also have the opportunity to use a green recovery and net zero carbon as a way of tackling the huge challenges that we're facing, both with COVID and recovery, and one has to fear from the implications of Brexit shortly. So thanks to our panelists, Annabel Clark, Andrew Turnbull, and Emma Davis, and do join us this time next week, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock on Wednesday, and for the final session in the CFCI climate emergency season. And this one is the final one is about how do we achieve net zero carbon, focusing on case studies, ambition, and the future standards and legislation. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you next week.